The night I lost my keys changed everything. 12 degrees outside. And I was stranded. A stranger's door opened before I could knock. "Come in," she said. "Before you freeze." I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know I'd fall in love with her. I didn't know she was already hiding a secret from me. My name is Maren Callahan. 32 years old. A paralegal living alone in Portland, Oregon. 3 months after calling off my engagement to a man named Todd. That December night, I stood shivering outside my apartment building, patting empty pockets, until a door across the hall creaked open and light spilled into the hallway. The woman in the doorway wore flannel pajamas and held a mug of tea, studying me with an amused, careful expression I hadn't earned yet. "You're the new tenant in 4B, she said. You. Get in here before you turn into an icicle." Joe's apartment smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, warm in a way my own place, still full of unpacked boxes, had never felt. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders without asking, handed me cocoa, and sat across from me like we'd known each other for years. I called the building manager, but he wouldn't come until morning. So Joe said simply, "Then you're stuck with me tonight." We talked until 2 in the morning about nothing important, and somehow that nothing felt more honest than any conversation I'd had in months. She was a middle school science teacher, funny in a dry way, with paint-stained fingers from a mural she was restoring at her school. When I finally fell asleep on her couch, I remember thinking I hadn't laughed like that since before Todd and I ended things. In the morning she made eggs, refused to let me apologize for intruding, and told me to knock any time I needed sugar or company. For the next week, I found reasons to knock sugar, a phone charger, questions about the mail, and she always answered smiling. One evening she left her door propped open by accident, and I understood, even then, that it wasn't an accident at all. We started having dinner together most nights, splitting takeout on her second-hand couch, arguing over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. I told myself we were just friends, 2 neighbors who happened to like each other's company, and for a while I almost believed it. Weeks passed, and the boundary between friendship and something else kept blurring. Though neither of us said so directly, Joe invited me to help finish her mural at school, and I spent a Saturday coated in blue paint, laughing more than I had in years. Her students called her a Reyes, and I watched how patient she was with a nervous kid struggling to hold a paintbrush steady. That night she told me she'd known she was gay since she was 15, and came out to her family at 19. No apologies given. I admired how easily she said it, like a fact about herself rather than a confession, while I still flinched at the word. My mother called that same week, asking again if Todd and I might work things out, as though our breakup were a misunderstanding to fix. I told her no, without explaining that the real reason I'd left Todd was a feeling I hadn't let myself name yet. Joe noticed I went quiet after those calls, and instead of prying, she just handed me a mug of tea and changed the subject. One rainy Friday, the power went out across the building, and we ended up huddled under blankets, sharing one flashlight and an old deck of cards. Somewhere between hands of gin rummy, our knees kept touching, and neither of us moved away, though both of us noticed. "You're staring," Joe said, grinning. And I laughed it off, though my heart was pounding harder than a card game should cause. I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. The curve of her smile, the way she hummed while cooking, the sound of her laugh through the wall. My best friend Priya visited from Seattle and met Joe over brunch, then cornered me afterward asking, "Since when do you light up like that around someone?" I brushed her off, insisting Joe was just a good friend, though even I could hear how unconvincing that sounded out loud. That night I lay awake replaying the way Joe had looked at me across the table, and I finally admitted to myself what it meant. I hadn't dated a woman before, hadn't even let myself imagine it seriously, and the realization felt less like fear and more like recognition. 20 years of expectations don't unravel in one night. And I woke up the next morning telling myself to be careful, to slow down. Jo, for her part, never pushed, never asked what I wanted, just kept showing up steady and warm, letting me find my own way there. We started taking Sunday walks along the waterfront, coffee in hand, talking about everything from her students to my complicated relationship with my mother. During one walk, she mentioned an ex-girlfriend named Renee, briefly, carefully, and I felt an unexpected pang of jealousy I wasn't ready to examine. We were together 3 years, Jo said. It ended badly. I don't really talk about it. I let the subject drop, sensing an old wound. One evening, cleaning out a closet, I found the spare key Todd had once cut for himself and realized I'd never asked for it back. I mailed it to him without a note, a small closing of a door I hadn't fully shut, and felt lighter walking home in the cold. Jo was waiting on the stairwell when I got back, as if she'd sensed something had shifted, and asked simply, "You okay?" "I think I finally am," I told her. And for a moment neither of us said anything else, just stood there in the quiet hallway. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore, a current running under every conversation, every shared meal, every lingering glance. At her birthday dinner with her close friends, someone asked jokingly if we were dating, and Jo laughed it off, but her eyes found mine first. Later that night, walking me to my door, she hesitated, like she wanted to say something, then just said goodnight and disappeared into her apartment. I stood in my hallway for a long time afterward, hand still on the doorknob, wondering what would have happened if one of us had been braver. The next morning, an unsigned note appeared under my door. "I like you. I have for a while. No pressure. G." My hands were shaking as I read it 3 times, feeling something crack open in my chest that I'd kept sealed for years. I didn't reply right away, terrified and thrilled in equal measure, unsure how to hold something this big without dropping it. That evening I knocked on her door, note in hand, and before I could speak, she said, "You don't have to say anything back." "I want to," I said, and told her, haltingly, that I liked her too, that I had for weeks, maybe longer than I'd admit. She smiled like the sun coming out after a long Portland winter, and asked if she could take me to dinner properly, as an actual date. I said yes before she finished the sentence, and we both laughed at how ridiculous it was that a lost key had led us here. Our first real date was simple, noodles at a hole-in-the-wall restaurant, but I remember every detail, down to the song playing when she reached for my hand. Walking home, she asked permission before kissing me, and when I nodded, the kiss felt like something I'd been waiting my whole life for without knowing it. I told Priya everything the next day, and she just laughed and said, "Finally, I've been waiting for you to catch up to yourself." Not everyone would be so easy. I knew that. But for one golden week, it felt like nothing outside that hallway could touch us. We kept it quiet at first, savoring something new and fragile, not ready yet for the questions and reactions the wider world might bring. Jo took me to meet a few close friends, all of whom already adored me from her stories, which both flattered and terrified me. I hadn't told my mother anything yet, hadn't found the words, and some nights that silence sat heavy in my chest like a stone. Jo never pressured me to come out before I was ready, though I could sense, sometimes, a quiet worry behind her patience. One night she admitted Renee had left because she got tired of being the secret, and I understood exactly what she was really telling me. I promised her I wasn't going to make the same mistake, though promises are easier spoken in a warm apartment than kept in daylight. Spring arrived, and with it, an invitation to my cousin's wedding back in my hometown, an event I knew would test everything I'd promised. I asked Jo to come with me, and watched her face shift through surprise, hope, and hesitation before she finally said yes. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Your family doesn't know about us yet." I said I wanted them to meet her as exactly who she was. We spent the weeks before the wedding rehearsing conversations I hoped I'd never actually have to have, bracing for reactions I couldn't predict. My mother called to confirm +1s, and I told her, voice steadier than I felt, that I was bringing my girlfriend. Yo. There was a long silence on the line before she simply said, okay, in a tone I couldn't read at all, and hung up shortly after. The drive to my hometown felt endless, Joe's hand steady on mine while I rehearsed introductions that kept dissolving the moment I tried to picture them. My father greeted us at the door, shook Joe's hand politely, but the tightness in his jaw told me everything about how hard this was for him. My mother hugged me too briefly, then turned to Joe with a smile so careful it looked painful, and said only, nice to finally meet you. Dinner that night was full of small, sharp silences, relatives glancing at us and then quickly away, conversations changing subject whenever we approached. My Aunt Carol, 3 glasses of wine in, asked loudly why I'd given up on a real family, and the table went completely still. Joe squeezed my hand under the table, steady and grounding, while I fumbled through an answer that satisfied no one, least of all myself. Later, alone in the guest room, I cried harder than I had in years, furious at myself for how much their reaction still hurt. Joe held me without saying much, just present, and told me gently that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for who I loved. The wedding itself was worse. My mother sat us at a table far from the family, and introduced Joe to no one as anything but Marin's friend. I confronted her quietly in the hallway, asking why she couldn't even say the word girlfriend, and she said, give me time. Marin. Please. I've given you my whole life, I told her, my voice breaking, and walked away before she could see exactly how much that cost me. We left the reception early, Joe driving in silence while I stared out the window, replaying every uncomfortable look from the day. Back in Portland, I threw myself into work, partly to avoid thinking about my family, partly because a new problem was quietly brewing there too. A coworker named Brett, who'd seen a photo of Joe and me on my desk, started making pointed comments about personal choices during meetings. I brushed it off at first, but the comments grew sharper, and I began to suspect he was building towards something more deliberate. One afternoon, my supervisor called me in and said someone had raised concerns about whether my personal life might affect client relationships at the firm. I sat frozen, humiliated, understanding that Brett had turned quiet gossip into something that could threaten the career I'd worked years to build. Joe was furious when I told her, wanting to march into my office and demand accountability, but I begged her to let me handle it my own way. That night, doubt crept in uninvited. What if being with Joe cost me everything? My family, my career, the life I'd carefully built? I didn't voice that fear to her, but she read it in my silence anyway, and something guarded settled behind her eyes for the first time. Around then, Renee resurfaced, a text out of nowhere asking Joe to coffee to talk things through. 3 years after their breakup, Joe mentioned it casually, almost too casually, and I felt an old insecurity flare up, sharper than I expected it to be. You're not going, are you? Asked, hating how small my voice sounded, and Joe hesitated just long enough for my stomach to drop. I think I need closure, she said. It's not about you, but it felt like it was about me, about whether I was enough. She went to meet Renee, and I spent that evening pacing my apartment, imagining every worst possible outcome, unable to focus on anything else. When she came back, she said Renee wanted to try again. That guilt and old feelings had complicated the conversation more than she'd expected. Did you want to? Asked, bracing for an answer I wasn't sure I could survive. And Joe took a long moment before responding. For a second. Out of habit. Maybe, she admitted. But no. I chose you the moment I decided to answer that text at all. I wasn't fully reassured. Not yet, and a distance crept between us that neither of us knew how to name or close. Meanwhile, at work, Brett filed a formal complaint, vague and unfounded, but enough to trigger a review from HR that left me sick with worry. I told my manager everything, calmly, professionally, while inside I felt like my carefully built life was cracking open at the seams. Joe showed up outside my office building after the meeting, coffee in hand, and just said, "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens." The HR investigation dragged on for weeks, and Brett, sensing he wasn't winning, escalated by spreading rumors that reached almost every department. I started dreading work, dreading the whispers, dreading the version of myself that existed now only as office gossip instead of a person. Joe grew increasingly protective, sometimes overwhelmingly so, showing up unannounced, checking in constantly, until it started to feel less like support and more like pressure. One night I snapped at her for hovering, and she snapped back that she was just trying to protect someone she loved, and we both went quiet, stung. "I don't need saving," I told her. "I need you to trust that I can handle this." She looked hurt, then nodded, and left without another word. For the first time since the night we met, an entire week passed without either of us knocking on the other's door. I missed her fiercely, but pride and exhaustion kept me from reaching out first. Even as the silence between us grew heavier each day, then the building manager posted a notice. The entire building had been sold. Tenants given 90 days to vacate before renovations began. Panic set in immediately, not just about housing, but about losing the hallway, the doorway, the whole accidental world where Joe and I had begun. I knocked on her door that night, notice in hand, forgetting our fight entirely in the face of something bigger threatening to separate us. She opened the door already holding her own copy of the notice, and for a moment we just stood there, absorbing the same fear together. "We'll figure it out," she said, pulling me inside. And just like that, the distance between us dissolved as quickly as it had formed. We spent that night making lists, calling landlords, realizing neither of us had actually discussed a future beyond this one lucky hallway. "Do you want a future with me?" Joe asked quietly, and I realized we'd never said it plainly, only implied it through months of shared dinners. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "I just didn't know if you wanted the same thing yet." "You're loghead." Relieved, and admitted she'd been terrified to bring it up first, afraid of scaring me away before I was ready. We agreed to look for a new place together. A real decision, not an accident of proximity, and it felt like a second beginning. But before we could celebrate too long, my mother called, voice tight, saying she needed to see me alone as soon as possible. I drove home that weekend without Joe, uneasy, sensing that whatever my mother wanted to say would test us in a new way. She met me on the porch, arms crossed against the cold, and said, "I need you to understand why this is so hard for me. When I was 20, my mother said, I had a sister, your Aunt Diane, who fell in love with a woman named Carol Ann. Our parents found out and disowned her within a week. I never saw her again. I let her go because I was too afraid to fight for her." I stood frozen on the porch, learning for the first time that I had an aunt whose entire existence had been erased from our family. "I've spent 30 years regretting my silence," my mother said, tears finally breaking through. "I won't make that mistake with you, Marin. I won't lose you too." She reached for my hand, awkward but sincere, and said she wanted to meet Joe properly, really meet her, not just tolerate her presence. Called Joe from the car, voice shaking, and told her everything about Diane, about my mother's fear, about the chance for something to finally change. Joe drove up that same night, and the three of us sat at my parents' kitchen table until nearly midnight, my mother asking real questions for the first time. It wasn't perfect. My father stayed quieter, still adjusting, but something essential had shifted. A door cracked open that had been sealed for decades. Driving back to Portland, lighter than I'd felt in months, I realized how much of my fear had been inherited rather than truly my own. Back at work, the HR investigation finally concluded, ruling in my favor and citing Brett's complaint as unsubstantiated and retaliatory in nature. Brett was quietly moved to another department, and weeks later, a colleague mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd recently come out to his own family. I understood then that some of his cruelty had likely come from his own fear. Though it didn't erase the damage, it complicated my anger toward him. With that behind me, Joe and I focused on apartment hunting, touring small units across the city, imagining a shared kitchen, shared mornings, a shared life. We found a place near the river, a little worn but full of light, and put down a deposit together on a Tuesday afternoon in April. For a few weeks, everything felt settled, almost easy. The kind of ordinary happiness I hadn't let myself believe I deserved. Then Joe came home distracted one evening, quieter than usual, and I asked what was wrong, sensing something she wasn't saying outright. "It's nothing," she said, too quickly. And I let it go, though the feeling of something withheld sat uneasily between us for days. I found out by accident, a letter from a school district in Seattle, offering Joe a position leading their new science curriculum program. She'd applied months earlier, before we'd even said we loved each other, and simply hadn't found the moment to tell me it had come through. "You were going to just leave?" asked, hurt cutting sharper than I expected. Betrayal mixing with the fear I thought we'd moved past. "I don't know what I was going to do," she admitted. "I didn't want to choose between you and an opportunity I've worked toward for years. So you decided not to tell me instead of trusting me to face it together," I said. And the accusation landed harder than either of us wanted. We fought that night. Really fought. Years of unspoken fears about worthiness and abandonment surfacing in words neither of us could take back easily. "Maybe I'm not enough of a reason to stay," I said, echoing every insecurity I'd carried since the wedding, since Renee, since Brett's whispers at work. Joe looked stricken. "Don't do that. Don't make my mistake about you being enough. This was never about that." But the damage was already done. I left her apartment that night for the first time since we'd started dating, walking the 4 steps back to my own door like a mile. Neither of us slept, I imagine. Both of us staring at ceilings separated by a hallway that suddenly felt wider than it ever had before. The next morning, the new apartment's landlord called asking for our final deposit, and I didn't know how to answer without knowing our own answer first. I avoided Joe for 3 days, throwing myself into distraction, while she left 2 voicemails I couldn't bring myself to listen to yet. On the 4th day, my mother called, of all people, and said simply, "Don't let fear write the ending." I did that once already. Something in her voice, still raw from her own regret, cut through my stubbornness in a way nothing else had managed to. I finally listened to Joe's voicemails, one apologizing, one saying she'd turned down the Seattle position without telling me, afraid I'd feel pressured either way. I knocked on her door, the same door that had once saved me from the cold, and this time she opened it before I even finished knocking. "I turned it down 3 days ago," she said. "Not because I'm scared of missing out. Because staying with you isn't a compromise. It's the choice. You should have told me you were considering it in the first place," I said. "I don't want you shrinking your life to protect my feelings." "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." I panicked. I've never had someone worth staying for before, and it terrified me more than leaving would have. We stood in that doorway a long time, not quite touching yet, both of us finally saying the fears we'd been circling for months. "I don't want you to give up opportunities for me," I told her. "But I do want you to trust me enough to try together." "Then let's actually try," she said, reaching for my hand. "No more secrets. Even the well-intentioned kind." "Deal." "Deal," I said. and meant it completely. We signed the lease on the river apartment that weekend, both our names on the paper. A small legal fact that felt enormous to me. Moving day arrived chaotic and joyful. Friends carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs while Joe directed traffic with a marker and too much coffee. That night, exhausted, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, we sat on the floor eating takeout, and I thought, this is what home actually feels like. A week later, my mother asked if she could visit the new apartment, her first real gesture toward becoming part of this new life. She arrived with a housewarming gift, a set of mugs, practical and unglamorous, and hugged Joe, genuinely this time, without the careful distance from before. Over dinner, she asked Joe real questions about her students, her family, her hopes, treating her like exactly what she was, my partner. Watching them talk easily in my new kitchen, I felt something in my chest finally unclench after months of carrying tension I hadn't realized I still held. Weeks passed in a steadier rhythm, work, weekends, small rituals building into something solid, something that finally felt permanent rather than provisional. Then, unexpectedly, an invitation arrived. My cousin's wedding photographer had tracked me down, wanting to feature real Portland love stories for a local magazine spread. Joe laughed at the idea of being magazine featured, but something about being asked, being seen publicly and without shame, moved me more than I expected. I hesitated before agreeing, old instincts to hide flaring briefly, before I remembered my mother's words about not letting fear write the ending. Let's do it, I told Joe. Let's actually let people see us. She kissed me, soft and certain, and said she'd been hoping I'd say yes. The interview and photo shoot were scheduled for the following month. Time, unknowingly, right alongside a family reunion neither of us was fully prepared for. The magazine feature ran 2 weeks before the reunion. A photo of Joe and me laughing in our kitchen. Captioned simply, "Home. Finally." 2 days after it published, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. Subject line reading only, "Are you Linda Callahan's daughter?" My hands trembled reading it. The sender introduced herself as Diane, my mother's estranged sister, now living 3 states away, who'd seen the article shared online. I called my mother immediately, barely able to speak, and read the email aloud while she went completely silent on the other end. "She saw us," my mother finally said, voice breaking. "After 30 years, she saw us. And she reached out anyway." She began crying. And so did I. We arranged for Diane to come to the family reunion, a decision my mother made without hesitation, determined this time not to let fear decide anything. The days before the reunion felt suspended, nerves and hope tangled together as we prepared to reunite a family broken decades before I was born. Joe held my hand through most of it, steady as ever, reminding me gently that whatever happened, we'd face it exactly the way we'd faced everything else together. The morning of the reunion, my father pulled me aside, visibly uncomfortable, and said he wanted to apologize for how distant he'd been since the wedding. "I didn't understand," he admitted. "I still don't. Fully. But I don't want to lose 30 years the way we lost Diane. I'm trying." Marin. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real. And I hugged him for the first time in months, feeling something meant that I'd feared was permanently broken. When Diane arrived, silver-haired and nervous, she and my mother stood frozen for a long moment before collapsing into each other's arms, sobbing openly. Watching 2 sisters reunite after 30 years of silence, I understood fully, for the first time, exactly what my mother had been so afraid of repeating. Diane pulled me aside later, studying my face for family resemblance, and said quietly, "I heard about you and your girlfriend. I'm so glad you didn't wait as long as I had to be seen." She'd spent decades believing her family wanted nothing to do with her, only to learn my mother had spent those same decades regretting every silent year. At the reunion dinner, my mother stood and, unprompted, raised a glass to family, old and new, and to finally choosing love over fear. She looked directly at me and Joe when she said it, and the entire table, aunts and cousins included, raised their glasses in return. It was the first time my extended family had openly, publicly acknowledged my relationship, and something in my chest finally released after years of quiet bracing. After dinner, Joe pulled me outside onto the porch, the same porch where my mother had once confessed her deepest regret months earlier. "I have something I want to ask you," Joe said, suddenly nervous in a way I'd rarely seen from her, hands fidgeting at her sides. My heart started pounding, sensing what was coming before she even reached into her jacket pocket for a small, unassuming ring box. "I know we've only been together a year," she said, "but I've never been more certain of anything than I am about you. About us. Will you marry me, Marin? Not because we have to prove anything to anyone, but because I want to build the rest of this with you." I said yes before she finished the question, laughing and crying at the same time, while through the window my family watched, some crying too. My mother was the first one outside, hugging us both fiercely, saying she'd never imagined getting to witness a moment like this in her own backyard. Diane hugged me next, whispering that she was living proof it was never too late to choose truth, even after decades of silence. My father shook Joe's hand, still a little stiff, but genuinely, and said, "Welcome to the family. For real this time." That night, driving home with Joe, the ring catching streetlight through the windshield, I felt the full weight of everything we'd survived to arrive here. The lost keys, the cold hallway, the note under my door, the wedding, Brett, Renee, the job offer, my mother's confession. All of it led to this. I thought about Diane, about the 30 years she'd lost, and made a quiet promise to never let fear cost me a single unnecessary day again. We told Priya the next morning, and she cried harder than either of us, insisting she'd known since that first brunch that this was inevitable. Joe's own family, though smaller and already accepting, welcomed the news warmly, already half joking about wedding dates before we'd even set one. We decided on a small wedding next spring, in the courtyard of our apartment building, close to the hallway where our story had actually begun. My mother offered to help plan everything, throwing herself into it with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. One detail at a time, Diane asked if she could walk part of the aisle beside my mother, an image that made both of them cry again just discussing it. Even my father, awkward as ever, asked what kind of flowers Joe liked, quietly trying, in his own limited way, to show he was truly present now. Work, too, had settled, Brett gone, HR closed, and a new sense of ease settling over days that had once felt like a minefield. Sometimes I still can't believe how much changed because I misplaced a set of keys on one freezing December night 2 years ago. Standing in our kitchen months later, watching Joe hum while cooking, ring catching the light, I understood that losing something can be how you find everything. On our wedding day, surrounded by family once broken and now mended, I married the woman who opened her door to a stranger in the cold. I used to think losing my keys was the worst luck of that December. Now I know it was the night I finally found my way home. Andy.